The decade after the First World War was a paradox of jubilation and fragility. The war's thunder had barely faded when the victorious United States emerged as a beacon of industry and wealth. Factories hummed with unprecedented productivity, cities blazed with electric light, and the air was thick with the promise that the horrors of the trenches had been buried for good. Across the Atlantic, Britain and her allies were financially drained, their empires weathered but intact, while America's economy surged with a vitality that made it seem invincible. In 1919, the United States was not just a nation, it was an idea. That prosperity could be permanent, that the engines of capitalism would never stall again. The 1920s came to be known as the Roaring Decade for good reason. New technologies, automobiles, radios, household appliances, were no longer novelties for the elite but everyday realities for the middle class. Electricity was spreading into towns that had once lived by lamplight. The Model T and its successors rolled off Ford's assembly lines in dizzying numbers, transforming the way Americans lived, worked, and traveled. Advertising boomed, telling Americans they not only could have more, they deserved more. The era celebrated instant gratification. Why save for tomorrow when you could buy now and pay later? This culture of credit, once confined to the purchase of homes or land, was now applied to radios, refrigerators, even clothing. The rhythm of daily life itself began to change. Jazz spilled from speakeasies, nightclubs roared until dawn, and the image of the independent flapper woman became a symbol of the age's liberated spirit. Across society, there was an almost unshakable belief in human progress. Political leaders like President Calvin Coolidge summed up the mood with phrases that would later seem almost tragically naive, famously declaring, "The business of America is business." The sentiment was simple. The system worked, the good times would last, and the government's role was to step aside and let industry flourish. Wall Street thrived in this atmosphere. What had once been the exclusive domain of seasoned financiers and wealthy magnates became a playground for millions of ordinary Americans. The sale of Liberty bonds during World War I had introduced many citizens to the idea of investing, and in the 1920s they were eager to try their hand at the stock market. Brokerage offices sprang up in towns far from New York, their ticker tape machines spitting out the latest prices like a direct line to fortune. A share in a company wasn't just a piece of paper, it was a ticket to the American dream. The technology of the time only fueled the frenzy. Ticker tape carried stock prices across the nation within minutes, and soon market updates were as common in beauty salons and railway stations as they were in financial houses. Newspapers devoted entire sections to the market's movements. Radio broadcasters read the latest gains and losses with the same energy they gave to sports scores. Celebrities like Charlie Chaplin and Groucho Marx dabbled in shares, their successes real or exaggerated, feeding the notion that anyone could get rich. By the middle of the decade, speculation had reached fever pitch. Investors, from small-town shopkeepers to Wall Street veterans, began buying stocks on margin, putting down only a fraction of the purchase price and borrowing the rest from their brokers. If the stock rose, so did their fortunes, magnified many times over. The trouble was, if it fell, losses would be just as swift and merciless. But in those heady years, no one seemed to believe in decline. The market had been rising for so long that caution seemed almost unpatriotic. Bankers and brokers encouraged the gamble. After all, loans for stock purchases were profitable for them, too. Internationally, the mood was equally deceptive. While Paris cafes were alive with writers and artists, and Berlin thrived in a fever of cultural experimentation, the political and economic underpinnings were already unstable. In Germany, the Weimar Republic balanced precariously on short-term American loans, its economy a fragile construction that looked solid only from a distance. In Italy, Mussolini's fascist regime tightened its grip, while in Soviet Russia, Stalin pushed his first five-year plan, transforming peasants into industrial workers by force and crushing dissent. These developments would later intertwine with the financial collapse, but in the mid-1920s, they were overshadowed by the hypnotic glow of apparent prosperity. The Roaring Twenties were a stage, brilliantly lit but supported by rotten timbers. Beneath the jazz, the champagne, and the ticker tape was a dangerous interdependence between American credit, European stability, and the belief that markets could defy the laws of gravity. Those who looked closely, like a handful of cautious bankers and economists, saw the cracks forming. But theirs were voices drowned out by the music of the age. For most, the illusion of endless growth was too sweet to question. The party, they believed, had only just begun. By the late 1920s, the American stock market had transformed into something more than a place to invest. It had become a national obsession. Across the country, from the marble halls of New York's financial district to dusty main streets in rural towns, the hum of the ticker tape was the heartbeat of ambition. The market was not merely a reflection of the economy. It was the economy in the eyes of millions. To own shares was to own a piece of the nation's future. The mechanics of speculation were deceptively simple and devastatingly dangerous. At its core was the practice of buying on margin, purchasing shares with only a fraction of their value paid in cash, borrowing the rest from brokers. A $100 share could be bought with as little as $10 down, the remaining $90 covered by a loan secured against the stock itself. As long as prices rose, the investors' returns multiplied astonishingly. A modest gain in the market could double or triple a small investor's money. But this magic worked both ways. When prices fell, the losses mounted with lethal speed. Brokers could demand immediate repayment, forcing investors to sell at the worst possible moment. What made this system so intoxicating was that it appeared infallible. For years, the market had climbed with relentless consistency. Newspapers ran daily reports of stocks hitting new highs. Radio announcers spoke of financial triumphs in the same breath as baseball scores. Popular magazines offered surefire tips from celebrity investors. Joseph P. Kennedy, father of a future president, was one of the most celebrated figures of this world. A man who had risen from modest beginnings to extraordinary wealth through shrewd, often ruthless market maneuvers. The fever of speculation infected all walks of life. School teachers, farmers, factory workers, and shopkeepers, many of whom had never set foot in New York, were suddenly trading shares. Small brokerage offices appeared in towns far from Wall Street, their windows crowded with locals watching the ticker roll. Technology accelerated this democratization of risk. Telegraph lines delivered prices to the farthest corners of the nation within minutes. In beauty parlors and hotel lobbies, people whispered the latest market gossip as eagerly as they discussed scandals or politics. The speculative frenzy extended beyond America's shores. European investors, eager to profit from America's industrial boom, poured money into U.S. markets. Germany's fragile Weimar economy, propped up by American loans, seemed steady enough to attract foreign confidence. In Paris, cafes buzzed with talk of Wall Street. In London, brokers watched the New York numbers as closely as their own exchange. The world's financial currents had become deeply intertwined, and any disturbance in New York would inevitably ripple across oceans. Behind the scenes, however, the structure of the market was dangerously unsound. Regulation was virtually non-existent. Insider trading was not only legal but commonplace. Wealthy syndicates would quietly buy large quantities of a stock, spread rumors to inflate its value, and then sell at the peak, leaving ordinary investors with the losses. Manipulation by pools of speculators could send a company's shares soaring or collapsing in days, with no connection to its actual business performance. Those on the inside called it smart money. Those on the outside called it bad luck. Even the most prestigious financial institutions were not immune to the temptations of the time. The House of Morgan, under the powerful hand of Thomas Lamont, avoided the more reckless gambles but still maintained close political ties that discouraged any government interference. Presidents Calvin Coolidge and Herbert Hoover both refrained from tightening credit or imposing rules on the market, fearing it might spoil the golden age. Hoover, in private, worried about an orgy of speculation. Yet in public he reassured Americans that the nation had reached a higher degree of comfort and security than ever existed before in the history of the world. For the small investor, the idea of a downturn seemed almost absurd. Stocks, they believed, could only go up. The myth of the new era was powerful. This was not like previous booms and busts, they said. Modern industry, scientific management, and America's boundless resources had rewritten the rules. Economists who warned of danger were dismissed as pessimists. Even when a few prominent bankers, like Paul Warburg, cautioned that unrestrained speculation would end in disaster, their voices were drowned out by the chorus of optimism. Yet the cracks were already showing. The soaring prices of stocks were often entirely detached from the company's actual earnings. Margin debt had reached unprecedented levels, creating a market propped up by borrowed money. Any sudden loss of confidence could trigger a chain reaction, force sales, collapsing prices, and the ruin of countless investors. The system was a tower built on sand, dazzling in the sunlight but awaiting the inevitable tide. In the autumn of 1929, the air on Wall Street carried a strange tension. Beneath the chatter of fortunes being made, there was a whisper of unease, subtle shifts in the market, a flicker of volatility that seemed out of place in such a confident age. A few shrewd players quietly sold their holdings, sensing the wind change. For the rest, the music played on, and the dance floor was still crowded. But somewhere in the machinery of the greatest financial boom in history, a gear had begun to slip. The first real chill came without warning. On Wednesday, October 23, 1929, the hum of the ticker tape began to take on a different tone. Share prices, which had marched upward with mechanical certainty for years, suddenly faltered. It began in the automobile sector. Blue-chip names like General Motors and Chrysler dipped sharply, sending an uneasy murmur through the canyons of Wall Street. Traders who had grown used to steady gains frowned at the sudden red ink. Some called it a healthy correction, a momentary pause in an otherwise unstoppable climb. But others, those with an ear for the deeper rhythm of the market, felt the tempo shift. The next morning, October 24th, later etched into memory as Black Thursday, the dam broke. As the market opened, sell orders flooded the floor of the New York Stock Exchange with a ferocity not seen in living memory. Prices plummeted in sickening drops. $2 for dollars, $10 a share, wiping out months, even years of paper gains in minutes. The gallery above the trading floor, usually filled with curious onlookers, was gripped by gasps and cries as the price boards flashed their grim verdicts. Outside, the streets of Lower Manhattan swelled with an estimated 10,000 people, drawn by the magnetic pull of disaster. They jammed the sidewalks from Broadway to the East River, craning for any scrap of news. From the steps of the Sub-Treasury building to the shadow of the statue of George Washington, clusters of men and women gathered, their faces tight with worry. Rumors flitted through the crowd like sparks. Some whispered that titans of finance had been ruined. Others claimed the government was about to intervene. The panic spread in waves. Selling begot more selling, as brokers issued margin calls. Demands for immediate cash to cover falling share values. Investors who had bought heavily on borrowed money found themselves trapped. To meet their obligations, they had to sell, driving prices down further. The very mechanism that had fueled the boom now became the engine of collapse. By mid-morning, the market slide had reached such intensity that the financial elite decided to act. In the offices of the House of Morgan at 23 Wall Street, Thomas Lamont gathered a handful of the most powerful bankers in America, including Charles E. Mitchell of National City Bank and Richard Whitney, vice president of the exchange. Their plan was as much theater as finance. Pool $250 million and use it to buy key stocks at prices above the market, broadcasting confidence to the world. Just before noon, Whitney strode onto the trading floor with the deliberation of a man on a mission. In full view of the room, he marched to the post for U.S. Steel, the most prestigious stock in America, and placed an order for 25,000 shares at a price far above the going rate. Gasps turned to cheers. He repeated the gesture with other blue-chip stocks, and for a moment it seemed to work. Prices steadied. Reporters outside Morgan's office carried the news to the throngs, and the mood shifted from despair to cautious relief. That afternoon, trading slowed. The banker's intervention had bought time, just enough for optimists to believe the worst was over. President Herbert Hoover, eager to reassure the nation, declared that the fundamental business of the country is on a sound and prosperous basis. Many took him at his word. But behind the scenes, the rescue was a thin bandage on a deep wound. The flood of sell orders had not stopped. It had only been delayed. Across America, small investors sat in their homes, awaiting the next day's ticker, unaware that the reprieve was temporary. Margin debts remained enormous, and confidence, the fragile lifeblood of the market, had been badly shaken. In brokerage houses from Chicago to San Francisco, traders worked late into the night, sorting through a tangle of unsettled accounts. Telegraph lines crackled with urgent messages. Bookkeepers, exhausted, collapsed at their desks or slept on the marble floors, trying to clear the backlog before the next opening bell. In living rooms, radios played dance music, but conversation inevitably drifted to the market. Should we sell? Should we hold? It can't get much worse, can it? What no one knew, what no one could yet imagine, was that Black Thursday was not the crash. It was merely the overture. In a matter of days, the market would plunge into a darkness so deep that the events of October 24th would be remembered not as the disaster itself, but as the first shudder of the earthquake. The weekend after Black Thursday was eerily calm. Newspapers carried hopeful headlines, praising the courage of the bankers who had saved the market. On Saturday, trading was uneventful, and the optimists clung to the belief that the worst had passed. Sunday church sermons spoke of weathering storms, of temporary trials before renewed prosperity. Yet beneath this public calm, the financial world was in chaos. Margin clerks, brokers, and bank officers worked through the weekend, sifting through a mountain of unsettled trades and frantic telegrams. Many discovered that their clients were already too deep in debt to be salvaged. When the market opened on Monday, October 28th, Black Monday, it became clear that the respite had been an illusion. Sell orders poured in like a flood breaking through a dam. Prices tumbled almost immediately, and the decline accelerated with each passing hour. The great industrial pillars of the American economy, U.S. Steel, General Electric, Westinghouse, were gutted before the eyes of stunned traders. The same brokers who had once smiled confidently over rising ticker tape now shouted themselves hoarse, their faces drawn tight with panic. The system that had made fortunes in the boom was now turning cannibal. Margin calls, demands for cash from investors who had bought with borrowed money, were being issued in waves. Those unable to pay had their holdings sold off automatically, forcing prices down further. It was a vicious spiral. The more the market fell, the more sales were triggered, and the deeper the plunge became. On the trading floor, the noise was deafening. Clerks scrambled between desks, slips of paper clutched in their fists, while messengers darted through the throng like hunted animals. The ticker tape lagged hours behind real time, making it impossible for many investors to know their exact losses. Outside, thousands gathered once more on Broad Street, their expressions harder now, less curiosity, more fear. Rumors of ruined fortunes traveled faster than the truth. If Monday had been a storm, Tuesday, October 29th, Black Tuesday, was the hurricane. Even before the exchange opened, the sidewalks were choked with people desperate for news. Inside, the first bell unleashed a torrent. Over 16 million shares would be traded that day, an unimaginable volume for the era. Stocks that had been considered untouchable collapsed in minutes. Radio Corporation of America, the darling of the decade, fell from heights that had once seemed invincible. General Motors, a symbol of American innovation, was stripped of half its value before midday. No banker's pool could stem this tide. The interventionist theater of the week before was useless now. The panic was too vast, the selling too relentless. In offices high above Wall Street, executives watched their life's work dissolve into numbers tumbling down price boards. Some sat in stunned silence. Others barked desperate orders to sell before the next drop. The emotional toll was immediate and brutal. For small investors who had bought on the promise of endless growth, the devastation was almost incomprehensible. Life savings evaporated in hours. Families who had lived comfortably the week before now faced the prospect of selling homes, delaying marriages, abandoning college plans. For the wealthy, the losses were staggering. For the middle class, they were ruinous. The newspapers called it the most disastrous day in the history of the stock market. By the close of trading, billions of dollars in paper wealth had vanished. The canyons of Lower Manhattan were littered with discarded ticker tape, as if the very entrails of the market had been spilled into the streets. Men and women shuffled away in silence, staring at the pavement, unwilling to meet each other's eyes. Yet this was only the beginning. The crash did not cause the Great Depression by itself, but it unleashed forces that would drag the world into a decade of hardship. Banks, already fragile, would begin to fail in alarming numbers. Businesses, starved of credit, would cut jobs and close doors. International trade, tangled in tariffs and debts, would wither. And in the vacuum left by economic collapse, new political storms would rise across the globe. In the final hours of Black Tuesday, as the closing bell rang through the exchange, the traders stood amid the wreckage of a market that had been the pride of a generation. The Roaring Twenties had ended, not with a slow fade, but with a shattering crash that could be heard in every corner of the world. When the closing bell sounded on Black Tuesday, the sound echoed far beyond the marble halls of the New York Stock Exchange. It reverberated through small towns and great cities, into farms and factories, across kitchen tables and office desks. The news traveled quickly, riding the airwaves of radio broadcasts and the bold headlines of evening editions. Billions lost, fortunes erased, markets in chaos. For those who had no money in stocks, it was still unsettling. For the millions who had borrowed to buy shares, it was devastating. In the days that followed, disbelief gave way to grim reality. Investors who had once proudly recited their holdings now faced margin calls they could not possibly meet. Some sold their homes or jewelry to raise cash. Others simply walked away from their debts, leaving brokers with worthless securities. Newspapers reported stories of once prosperous businessmen pawning watches to buy groceries, of clerks who had spent years saving only to see their nest eggs vanish in hours. The myth of the market as a safe road to wealth had been shattered. Banks, the quiet custodians of the nation's savings, soon found themselves at the center of the storm. The American banking system was a patchwork of small, independent institutions, most with no branches and little capacity to absorb losses. Many had lent heavily to investors during the boom, taking stock certificates as collateral. When those shares collapsed in value, the bank's balance sheets crumbled. By the end of 1929, hundreds of banks had failed, and in the years to come, thousands more would follow. In towns where the bank closed its doors, the effect was immediate and merciless. Depositors lined up outside in the cold, hoping to withdraw what little was left. Without deposit insurance, still years away, those who arrived too late often lost everything. A lifetime's savings could be erased not by theft or fire, but by a single lock clicking shut on the bank's front door. Panic fed on itself. News of one bank's failure would send customers rushing to withdraw funds from others, triggering more collapses. The collapse of credit rippled outward into the broader economy. Businesses that had relied on bank loans to buy raw materials or pay wages suddenly found their lines of credit cut off. Factories slowed production or closed altogether, throwing thousands out of work. In the countryside, farmers who had mortgaged their land during the prosperous years now faced foreclosure. Commodity prices plunged. Wheat and corn sold for less than the cost of production, leaving barns full but pockets empty. The human toll was visible everywhere. In New York, soup kitchens began to appear, funded by churches and charities. Men in worn suits stood in lines that stretched around city blocks, clutching tin cups or bowls. In rural areas, neighbors pooled resources to keep each other afloat. In cities, families doubled up in cramped apartments to share rent. Central Park, once a symbol of leisure, became home to a shantytown of cardboard and scrapwood shelters. Its residents, in bitter humor, called it Hooverville, after the president they blamed for their plight. Even for those still employed, the sense of security had evaporated. Pay cuts were common, hours were reduced, and the threat of layoffs hung over every payday. The culture of easy spending that had defined the 1920s dissolved into caution. Purchases were delayed, vacations canceled, and every coin was counted twice before it was spent. What had been an economy of optimism became one of fear. The crash also shattered illusions abroad. Foreign investors who had poured money into Wall Street during the boom now faced their own losses. The American market had been the engine of global capital flows, and when it stalled, economies from London to Berlin felt the jolt. For countries already burdened with war debts or dependent on U.S. loans, like Germany, whose fragile recovery rested on American credit, the blow was especially severe. In the final weeks of 1929, it became clear that this was not a passing storm. The market's collapse had triggered something deeper, a systemic failure of confidence, credit, and stability. The United States, once the great lender and industrial dynamo of the post-war world, was about to become the epicenter of a crisis that would spread, like a contagion, to every corner of the globe. By early 1930, the American crash had begun to metastasize into something far greater than a domestic financial disaster. The United States, the post-war world's chief creditor, had been the main artery through which capital flowed to Europe. Now that artery was severed, the loans that had kept fragile economies afloat, especially those of Germany and Austria, were suddenly called in or left unrenewed. For countries still paying reparations from the Great War, this was a death sentence for their already strained finances. Germany's prosperity in the late 1920s had been more appearance than reality, a delicate balance maintained by short-term American loans under the Dawes Plan. Foreign observers like Gustav Stresemann had warned that the Weimar economy was dancing on a volcano. When the loans stopped and the capital fled, the volcano erupted. Factories closed, unemployment soared, and the political center began to erode, creating fertile ground for extremist movements. The stability that had been painstakingly rebuilt after 1924 collapsed in a matter of months. Austria's dependence on international credit was even more acute. In Vienna, the largest bank, Creditanstalt, was heavily tied to industrial concerns that now faced plummeting demand. By 1931, its balance sheet was so weak that the bank failed outright, setting off a chain reaction of panic in neighboring countries. The failure was not confined to finance. It struck a blow to national pride, shaking confidence in Austria's ability to govern its own economic destiny. Britain, too, was far from immune. Though it had avoided the speculative excesses of Wall Street, its export-driven economy was deeply linked to global trade. The contraction in American imports hit British industry hard, especially in coal, steel, and textiles. By the summer of 1931, a run on the pound forced Britain to abandon the gold standard, shattering the myth of the currency's unassailable stability. The move sent ripples through the empire, altering trade patterns and weakening the economic bonds that had held its far-flung territories together. In France, the economy initially appeared more insulated, bolstered by a large gold reserve and relatively cautious banking practices. But as the crisis deepened and international demand contracted, even French industry and agriculture began to feel the chill. Political instability, already a hallmark of the Third Republic, worsened as coalition governments rose and fell in quick succession, unable to mount a coherent response. Beyond Europe, the Depression's reach was equally destructive. Japan, dependent on exports for its growing industrial base, saw foreign demand collapse, triggering deflation and social unrest. In Latin America, nations that had prospered by selling raw materials to industrial powers now faced falling prices and shrinking markets. The commodity bust was merciless. Copper mines in Chile closed, coffee growers in Brazil burned unsold beans as fuel, and Argentine wheat rotted in silos. International trade itself began to suffocate under the weight of protectionism. In June 1930, the U.S. Congress passed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, raising duties on over 20,000 imported goods in a misguided attempt to protect American jobs. Instead, it provoked retaliatory tariffs from other nations, slashing global commerce when cooperation was most needed. American exports to Europe plummeted by more than 2/3 in just 2 years, and imports fell just as sharply. The world's economies, already weakened, were now actively strangling one another. The crisis also began to reshape politics in ominous ways. In Germany, the collapse of the economy eroded public faith in parliamentary democracy. Extremist parties, the communists on the left and the National Socialists on the right, gained traction by promising decisive action and national revival. In Italy, Mussolini's fascist regime tightened its control, portraying the Depression as proof that liberal democracy had failed. Across Eastern Europe, military coups and authoritarian governments replaced fragile democratic experiments. The Soviet Union, insulated from global markets by its command economy, proclaimed itself immune to the capitalist collapse. Stalin used the crisis as propaganda, boasting that while capitalist nations suffered mass unemployment, Soviet factories roared ahead under the 5-year plan. In reality, forced collectivization and rapid industrialization brought their own human catastrophes, famines, purges, and mass repression, but the appearance of economic stability enhanced the Soviet Union's ideological appeal abroad. By the close of 1930, it was clear that the Great Depression was not merely an American tragedy. It was a worldwide unraveling of the post-war order. The financial crash had been the spark, but the tinder had been laid in the unresolved debts, trade imbalances, and political fragility left by the First World War. What had begun as a financial panic was mutating into a global crisis that would, before long, alter the course of history and set the stage for a new and even more devastating conflict. By 1931, the optimism that had defined the Roaring Twenties was a memory spoken of with disbelief. Across the United States, the Great Depression was no longer an abstract economic term. It was a daily reality etched into faces, homes, and streets. The numbers told part of the story. Millions of jobs lost, wages slashed, businesses shuttered. But the deeper truth lay in the small tragedies unfolding in towns and cities from coast to coast. Unemployment struck with a swiftness that shocked even seasoned laborers. In industrial hubs like Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Chicago, factories that had once run around the clock stood silent, their gates locked and machinery gathering dust. Steelworkers who had shaped the nation's skylines now stood in breadlines. Auto workers who had churned out Ford Model Ts wandered the streets in search of day labor. Those still employed lived with the constant fear of being called into the boss's office to hear the words, "We have to let you go." The countryside fared no better. Farmers, already struggling with falling crop prices, were crushed under the twin burdens of debt and drought. Wheat and corn sold for less than the cost of production, and the relentless heat of the early 1930s withered fields before they could yield a harvest. Mortgages went unpaid, and auctioneers arrived to sell off land that had been in families for generations. In the Great Plains, whispers of an even greater environmental disaster to come, the Dust Bowl, were already in the air. Everywhere, the symbols of the old prosperity took on a bitter irony. Shuttered movie palaces with glittering marquees stood dark, their silent stages a reminder of better days. Department store windows still displayed fine clothes and goods, but fewer and fewer people stepped inside. Automobiles, once a proud emblem of freedom, sat idle in driveways because their owners could no longer afford gasoline or repairs. In the cities, shantytowns sprang up in abandoned lots, under bridges, and in public parks. These makeshift settlements, dubbed Hoovervilles in a scathing jab at President Herbert Hoover, were built from scavenged wood, tin, and cardboard. They had no running water, no sanitation, and little protection from the elements. Families huddled under patched blankets, cooking meager meals over open fires. The breadline became a defining image of the era. Sponsored by churches, charities, or sympathetic shopkeepers, they stretched for blocks, men and women waiting in the cold for a ladle of soup or a piece of bread. Pride was often swallowed in silence. Those who had once donated to such causes now stood among the needy. Even the better-off learned caution. Frivolous spending vanished, luxuries were postponed, and every penny was accounted for. For children, the Depression shaped their world in subtle but lasting ways. School shoes were passed down until they no longer fit, meals were smaller, and treats were rare. Many left school early to work odd jobs, contributing what little they could to the family income. The idea of making do became ingrained in their thinking, a habit that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. Migration became a survival strategy. Families packed their belongings into battered cars or onto freight trains, chasing rumors of work in other states. Some drifted toward California's agricultural valleys, lured by talk of seasonal harvest jobs. Others sought opportunities in industrial cities that seemed less battered by the downturn. Too often, they found the same scarcity and competition wherever they went. Yet even in the midst of hardship, resilience emerged. Neighbors shared what they had, pooling food for communal meals. Local barbers offered free haircuts to the unemployed. Grocers extended credit to longtime customers they knew might never pay them back. Music and radio offered a brief escape. Families gathered around the set to listen to popular comedies, dramas, or President Hoover's rare addresses. Still, the underlying despair was inescapable. The Depression had stripped away not just jobs and savings, but the belief that prosperity was the natural state of the nation. It was a collective loss of innocence, proof that the American dream could vanish as quickly as it had appeared. And as months turned into years, the question on every lip was no longer, when will it get better? But, can it get better at all? In Europe, the Great Depression was not merely an economic catastrophe, it was a political accelerant. The financial crash of 1929 had crossed the Atlantic as swiftly as a telegraphed headline, but in its wake came something more corrosive, a collapse of trust in the post-war order. For countries still nursing the wounds of the First World War, the Depression was less a sudden blow than the final shattering of a fragile, uneasy peace. Germany, burdened by reparations and dependent on American loans, was the first to feel the full force. The Weimar Republic had always been a delicate balancing act, its economy precariously tied to foreign credit through the Dawes and Young plans. When American capital evaporated, the facade crumbled. By 1930, industrial production had dropped by a quarter, and unemployment reached into the millions. Men who had survived the trenches now stood in breadlines. Young people too young to remember the war were facing a future with no jobs at all. The political consequences were immediate and dangerous. The Reichstag, already fractured, descended into paralysis. The center parties, unable to deliver relief, lost ground to extremists promising decisive action. On the left, the communists rallied disillusioned workers with visions of Soviet-style revolution. On the right, the National Socialists, until recently a fringe group, began their meteoric rise. Adolf Hitler's message of national rebirth and the scapegoating of Jews and November criminals resonated with a public desperate for someone to blame. In 1928, the Nazis had barely scraped 2.6% of the vote. By September 1930, they had surged to 18%, becoming the second largest party in Germany. Austria, too, felt the pressure. Its banking system was tightly interwoven with Germany's economy, and when loans dried up, the country's largest bank, Creditanstalt, found itself in crisis. Though the collapse would not come until 1931, the Depression had already begun eroding Austria's social fabric, deepening divisions between conservatives, socialists, and fascist-leaning paramilitary groups. Britain, though spared the spectacle of political extremism on the German scale, was sliding into its own malaise. Its coal mines, shipyards, and textile mills, the backbone of its industrial might, were crippled by falling global demand. The Labour government of Ramsay MacDonald, promising to conquer unemployment, found itself instead presiding over its relentless rise. By 1931, economic pressure would fracture the party itself, forcing MacDonald into a coalition with the Conservatives, a move seen by many as political betrayal. In France, the Depression hit more slowly, but it struck at a system already notorious for short-lived coalition governments. While the cafés of Paris still hummed with chatter and art, rural France began to feel the strain as agricultural prices collapsed. Political instability remained a constant, with governments rising and falling too quickly to mount a sustained response. In Italy, Mussolini used the crisis to tighten his grip. The Lateran Treaty of 1929 had cemented his regime's alliance with the Catholic Church, giving him moral legitimacy alongside political power. Now, as the Depression spread, Mussolini framed fascism as the antidote to democratic weakness. Public works programs, youth movements, and a relentless propaganda machine reinforced the idea that Italy, under his rule, was immune to the chaos engulfing liberal economies. Meanwhile, in the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin stood apart from the capitalist world's collapse. The USSR was insulated from Wall Street's ruin by its self-contained command economy. From Moscow, Stalin proclaimed the superiority of socialism, using the Depression as proof that capitalism was doomed. Soviet propaganda painted scenes of bustling factories and expanding industry, omitting the brutal realities of forced collectivization, famine, and purges. For some abroad, especially in countries where unemployment bred disillusionment, this image of a thriving socialist state was compelling. By the close of 1930, Europe was in the grip of a dangerous transformation. Economic despair was eroding faith in democracy, and the extremes, both left and right, were seizing the opportunity. The crash had begun as a financial panic, but in Europe it was becoming something more volatile, a political crisis that threatened to upend the continent's fragile peace. The conditions for a new kind of war were quietly, steadily falling into place. If 1929 was the spark and 1930 the slow spread of the fire, then 1931 was the year the flames consumed the structure of the global economy. What had begun as a crisis of stock prices and loans now tore into the foundations of finance itself, bringing down institutions once thought unshakable. The first great collapse came in Vienna. The Creditanstalt, Austria's largest and most respected bank, had long been a symbol of stability, its boardroom boasting connections to London, Paris, and New York. But years of quietly absorbing failing businesses had left it dangerously overextended. When the truth came out in May 1931, that the bank's losses were far beyond what its reserves could cover, shock swept through Europe's financial circles. Creditanstalt failure was more than a domestic disaster. It was a signal that the very heart of Central European finance was rotten. The panic spread instantly. Investors, fearing similar weakness, began pulling deposits from banks across Austria and neighboring countries. Germany, already reeling from the withdrawal of American loans, was next. Berlin's banks faced a run as foreign creditors demanded repayment and domestic customers withdrew cash by the millions. In the first 3 weeks of June, Germany lost nearly half its gold reserves. President Herbert Hoover, alarmed by the speed of the collapse, proposed a 1-year moratorium on war debt and reparations payments. The plan was intended to give Germany breathing space and calm the markets. But a crucial political blunder delayed its effect. The Hoover administration had failed to secure French agreement in advance. France, holding one of the world's largest gold reserves, refused to commit until its own demands were met, including restrictions on German naval construction and nationalist rallies. By the time the moratorium was agreed upon in July, the financial hemorrhage was irreversible. Germany's third-largest bank, the Darmstadter UND National Bank, failed on July 13th. The Reichsbank, drained of gold, could not mount a rescue. The government declared a two-day bank holiday in a desperate bid to stop the panic. The closures deepened the public's fear, pushing more people to hoard cash and gold in their homes. Across Eastern and Southern Europe, from Hungary to Spain, smaller banks collapsed in rapid succession. Even Britain, long regarded as the world's financial anchor, was swept into the storm. Investors began doubting the Bank of England's ability to maintain the pound's link to gold. As foreign holders of sterling rushed to convert their currency into gold, Britain's reserves drained at an alarming rate. By September, Prime Minister Ramsay MacDonald's government faced a stark choice: defend the gold standard through crippling austerity, or abandon it altogether. On September 21st, Britain chose the latter. The pound was allowed to float, losing nearly a third of its value in days. The decision stunned the world. If the pound could fall, what currency was safe? In the United States, the shockwaves rebounded with brutal force. International uncertainty sent foreign investors pulling money from American banks and markets. At the same time, fear at home drove ordinary Americans to withdraw deposits, weakening already fragile institutions. By the end of 1931, more than 2,000 U.S. banks had failed in that year alone, their closures erasing the savings of millions. The breakdown of the global financial system accelerated the collapse of trade. Tariff walls, already high after the Smoot-Hawley Act, grew even taller as nations tried to shield their industries from foreign competition. Instead of protecting jobs, these policies strangled commerce. By the close of 1931, global trade had fallen by nearly half compared to pre-crash levels. Factories that once exported goods to every corner of the globe now stood idle. Amid the wreckage, political consequences multiplied. In Germany, Chancellor Heinrich Brüning's government ruled increasingly by emergency decree, bypassing the Reichstag and deepening public frustration. In Britain, the Labour Party split under the strain of economic crisis, with MacDonald forming a coalition national government dominated by conservatives, a move many saw as a betrayal of Labour's working-class base. Across Europe, extremist movements on both ends of the spectrum pointed to the Depression as proof that parliamentary democracy was incapable of solving national emergencies. By year's end, the optimism that had clung stubbornly to the edges of public life in 1929 and 1930 was gone. The Depression was no longer a series of economic setbacks. It was a wholesale collapse of the global order, a dark tide that respected no border, spared no class, and left no institution beyond doubt. The pillars of finance, politics, and trade had fallen, and the world was entering uncharted territory. By 1932, the Great Depression was no longer an unfolding crisis. It was the world's daily reality. The economic collapse had seeped into every corner of life, grinding down the morale of nations and the resolve of their leaders. There was no illusion of a quick recovery now. The question had shifted from when the crisis would end to whether societies could survive its relentless pressure without tearing themselves apart. In the United States, unemployment reached levels unimaginable just a few years earlier. 1 in 4 workers was without a job. In some industrial cities, the figure approached 50%. Breadlines stretched for blocks in New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia. Hoovervilles, those sprawling shanty towns of scrap wood, tin, and cardboard, multiplied in parks and empty lots, their residents huddling around barrel fires to keep warm. Formerly middle-class families now lived in tents or abandoned buildings, trying to hold onto some shred of dignity as they queued for soup ladles and stale bread. The plight of farmers was equally grim. Commodity prices had fallen so low that wheat, corn, and cotton might as well have been worthless. Many farmers watched their crops rot in the fields because harvesting them cost more than they would earn from a sale. Foreclosures swept through the Midwest and the South, dispossessing families who had worked the same land for generations. In protest, desperate farmers staged penny auctions, where neighbors would bid absurdly low prices for foreclosed property, then return it to the original owner, defying the bank's attempts to reclaim their collateral. President Herbert Hoover's response only deepened public frustration. Committed to the idea that direct federal relief would undermine individual initiative, he relied on local governments, charities, and volunteerism to ease the suffering, a patchwork approach wholly inadequate to the scale of the disaster. His administration did expand public works and created the Reconstruction Finance Corporation to provide emergency loans to banks and businesses. But to the unemployed and the homeless, these measures felt like aid for the wealthy while ordinary citizens were left to fend for themselves. Discontent was no longer confined to quiet despair. It spilled into the streets. In the summer of 1932, Washington, D.C. became the stage for one of the most poignant protests of the era, the Bonus Army. Thousands of World War I veterans, many with families in tow, marched on the Capitol to demand early payment of bonuses promised for their wartime service. They built a vast encampment on the Anacostia Flats, a shanty city within sight of the Capitol Dome. The government's refusal, and the eventual violent eviction of the protesters by the U.S. Army under General Douglas MacArthur, shocked the nation and tarnished Hoover's already battered reputation. Beyond America's shores, the same desperation was fueling radical politics. In Germany, unemployment surpassed 6 million. The Nazi Party, capitalizing on economic despair, nationalist resentment, and fear of communism, surged to become the largest party in the Reichstag by July 1932. Hitler's rallies drew vast crowds, his message of unity and renewal wrapped around promises to tear up the Versailles Treaty and restore Germany's pride. Across the political divide, the communists also gained ground, feeding off working-class anger. The Weimar Republic was becoming ungovernable, its parliament deadlocked between extremes. In Britain, the national government struggled to stem unemployment, which hovered near 3 million. Industrial regions, especially in the north, were devastated, their mines and mills silent. Hunger marches wound their way from these distressed regions to London, demanding relief and jobs. Although Britain's departure from the gold standard in 1931 had eased some financial pressures, it had not revived domestic industry or restored hope to the jobless. In France, the Depression's impact deepened in rural areas, where falling agricultural prices impoverished small farmers. Urban unemployment rose slowly but steadily, while political instability continued to plague the Third Republic. Coalition governments came and went in rapid succession, none able to muster the will or consensus for decisive action. Even in the Soviet Union, largely insulated from the capitalist collapse, 1932 was a year of tragedy. Stalin's forced collectivization of agriculture, begun in the late 1920s, reached its most brutal phase. Grain requisitioning stripped villages of food, and famine swept through Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and parts of Russia, claiming millions of lives. While Soviet propaganda boasted of new factories and rising industrial output, the human cost was hidden from the world, leaving some foreign observers still convinced that the USSR had avoided the Depression's misery. By the end of 1932, the Depression had hardened into something more than an economic crisis. It was a crucible reshaping politics, societies, and human expectations. Faith in traditional systems was eroding. The political center in many nations was collapsing. In its place rose voices that promised not gradual recovery, but dramatic, even dangerous change. The year closed with the world balanced on a knife edge, the shadow of an even darker future beginning to take shape. The dawn of 1933 found the world exhausted by years of crisis. For winters had passed since the crash of 1929, and for many, hardship had become as routine as the seasons. Yet in two nations at the center of the global stage, the year would bring dramatic shifts in leadership, shifts that would shape not only the course of the Depression, but the trajectory of the century itself. In the United States, the public's patience with Herbert Hoover had long since evaporated. His cautious, incremental approach had failed to reverse the economic collapse, and the bitter scenes of the bonus army's eviction had become a symbol of governmental indifference. The presidential election of November 1932 was a landslide. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the Democratic governor of New York, swept into office promising a New Deal for the American people. His campaign had offered more optimism than specifics, but it was the optimism that mattered. By the time Roosevelt took the oath of office on March 4, 1933, the American banking system was in free fall. In the weeks before his inauguration, panic withdrawals had closed thousands of banks. In Michigan, a statewide bank holiday had been declared to stem the collapse, and other states were following suit. The new president acted immediately. Within days, he called a nationwide bank holiday, suspending all banking activity until Congress could pass emergency legislation. The Emergency Banking Act provided federal support to sound banks and shuttered insolvent ones. Roosevelt's first fireside chat explained these measures directly to the public, restoring enough confidence that deposits began flowing back into the system when the banks reopened. The banking crisis was only the beginning. In his first 100 days, Roosevelt unleashed a torrent of legislative action aimed at relief, recovery, and reform. The Civilian Conservation Corps put young men to work on environmental projects. The Agricultural Adjustment Administration sought to stabilize crop prices. The Tennessee Valley Authority brought electricity and flood control to a vast rural region. These initiatives did not end the Depression, but they signaled a break with the hands-off policies of the past. Government was now an active participant in shaping the economy and Roosevelt's personal assurance. His blend of charm, resolve, and experimentation began to rebuild hope. Across the Atlantic, Germany was undergoing a far darker transformation. Years of economic misery and political paralysis had driven the Weimar Republic to the brink of collapse. In the July 1932 elections, the Nazi Party had become the largest in the Reichstag, though they lacked an outright majority. Attempts to form stable governments failed. Chancellor after chancellor fell to deadlock and intrigue. President Paul von Hindenburg, the aging hero of the First World War, resisted appointing Adolf Hitler as chancellor, wary of his radicalism. But by January 1933, the conservative elites around Hindenburg concluded they could harness Hitler's popularity for their own purposes. On January 30th, Hitler was sworn in as Chancellor of Germany. The Nazis moved quickly. In February, the Reichstag fire provided the pretext for an emergency decree suspending civil liberties and allowing the arrest of political opponents. In March, the Enabling Act granted Hitler's cabinet the power to legislate without parliamentary consent, effectively dismantling the Weimar Republic's democratic framework. Within months, opposition parties were banned, trade unions dissolved, and the machinery of a one-party dictatorship firmly in place. Economic policy under the new regime was inseparable from its ideological goals. The Nazis launched massive public works programs, most famously the construction of the Autobahn network, while rearming the military in defiance of the Versailles Treaty. Unemployment began to fall, not solely due to job creation, but also through the exclusion of Jews and women from parts of the labor force. Propaganda trumpeted these gains as proof that Hitler was restoring Germany's strength, even as the regime's racial policies and political repression deepened. Elsewhere in Europe, 1933 brought its own tremors. In Britain, recovery was slow but steady after abandoning the gold standard in 1931, though unemployment in industrial regions remained stubbornly high. France, still clinging to the gold standard, would soon face growing economic strain. In the Soviet Union, Stalin pushed ahead with industrialization, boasting of record output while famine ravaged Ukraine and other regions. But it was in Washington and Berlin that the sharpest contrasts emerged. In the United States, the Depression had brought forth a leader who embraced democratic institutions while expanding the government's role in economic life. In Germany, it had paved the way for a leader who dismantled democracy entirely, promising national revival at the cost of freedom. The year closed with both nations charting their new courses, one toward experimentation within democracy, the other toward a dictatorship whose ambitions would soon threaten the world. By the middle of the 1930s, the Great Depression had become a fixture of life, a grinding backdrop against which nations charted their recovery, or descended further into instability. In some countries, the worst of the economic collapse had passed, yet prosperity remained elusive. In others, political change had altered the course of the crisis entirely, for better or for worse. In the United States, Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal programs had delivered visible results. Millions of Americans were back at work through initiatives like the Works Progress Administration, building roads, bridges, schools, and parks. Rural electrification brought light to farms that had never seen a power line. Farmers received subsidies to stabilize prices, and new laws regulated banks, securities, and labor relations. Roosevelt's fireside chats kept the public informed and reassured, weaving a sense of national purpose into the hard labor of recovery. Yet full recovery remained out of reach. Unemployment, though reduced from its peak, still hovered near 15%. Many private businesses remained wary of investing, uncertain about the shifting rules of the economic game. Critics from the right decried the New Deal as an overreach of federal power. Critics from the left argued it was too timid, leaving millions in poverty while the wealthy retained their grip on resources. The U.S. economy was more stable but fragile, its revival incomplete and vulnerable to new shocks. In Germany, Hitler's regime was transforming the nation at an astonishing pace. Massive state investment in infrastructure and military rearmament slashed unemployment figures. The Autobahn network expanded across the Reich, and factories that had stood idle roared back to life producing weapons, vehicles, and uniforms. Propaganda celebrated the economic miracle, while the state's repressive machinery silenced dissent. Jews, political opponents, and others deemed undesirable were systematically excluded from the workforce, their livelihoods destroyed. This apparent prosperity was built on coercion, racial persecution, and a militarized economy that was already preparing for future conquest. Italy under Mussolini followed a similar, if less efficient, path. Public works projects, autarkic economic policies, and colonial ambitions, most notably the 1935 invasion of Ethiopia, were used to rally national pride and distract from ongoing economic weakness. International condemnation of the invasion led to sanctions from the League of Nations, but these measures were half-hearted and poorly enforced, revealing the League's inability to check aggressive powers. Britain, having left the gold standard earlier, saw a modest recovery, aided by low interest rates and a housing boom in the south of England. But its traditional industrial regions, coal, steel, shipbuilding, remained depressed. The government avoided massive public spending, preferring cautious fiscal policies and imperial trade agreements that sought to strengthen economic ties within the British Empire. France, clinging to the gold standard until 1936, endured prolonged stagnation. Political instability remained the norm, with frequent changes in government preventing any sustained policy approach. When the left-wing Popular Front, led by Léon Blum, came to power in 1936, it introduced sweeping labor reforms, reducing the workweek, granting paid vacations, and strengthening unions. But these measures met fierce resistance from business leaders and conservative politicians, and the economic gains proved short-lived. The Soviet Union, isolated from global markets, presented itself as a model of resilience. Stalin's five-year plans had transformed the USSR into a rapidly industrializing power, producing steel, machinery, and armaments at unprecedented rates. Foreign visitors, often guided through carefully staged tours, marveled at the apparent dynamism of Soviet industry. Yet behind the facade lay the grim reality of purges, forced labor, and the lingering trauma of famine. Globally, the mid-1930s saw a dangerous turn toward economic nationalism. Tariff barriers remained high, currency blocks emerged, and international trade never returned to its pre-depression vitality. The collapse of global cooperation had political consequences. The League of Nations, undermined by its failure to act against aggression in Manchuria and Ethiopia, was increasingly irrelevant. Nations began to look inward or toward expansion as solutions to their economic woes. Japan, constrained by limited natural resources and shut out of many foreign markets, pursued imperial expansion as economic policy. Having seized Manchuria in 1931, Tokyo consolidated control through the puppet state of Manchukuo and eyed further conquests in China. Its military leaders argued that only by dominating East Asia could Japan secure the raw materials and markets it needed. By 1936, the world was splitting into divergent paths. Democracies wrestled with incomplete recoveries and political divisions. Authoritarian states boasted rapid economic revival, but tied their fortunes to militarization and territorial ambition. The Depression had not merely altered economies. It had reshaped the political map, eroding the space for compromise and planting the seeds for the next global conflict. The lessons of the 1929 crash were being learned in vastly different ways, and in those differences lay the fault lines of the future. By 1936, there were signs that parts of the world had begun to claw their way out of the Depression's depths. In the United States, unemployment had fallen, industrial output was climbing, and the stock market had regained some of its lost ground. Roosevelt's New Deal had not restored full prosperity, but it had reestablished a measure of stability and hope. Abroad, authoritarian regimes boasted of rapid recoveries and newfound strength. Yet beneath the surface, the foundations remained unsteady, and the gains were far more fragile than many realized. In America, the mid-1930s were a time of cautious optimism. New Deal programs had reshaped the economic landscape. Social Security provided a safety net for the elderly, labor rights had been strengthened, and vast public works projects were transforming the country's infrastructure. The Tennessee Valley Authority lit up rural communities, and the Works Progress Administration employed millions in construction, art, and education. For the first time since the crash, many Americans began to believe the worst was behind them. But the recovery rested on delicate balances. In 1937, wary of mounting deficits, the Roosevelt administration decided to cut federal spending and tighten credit. The result was swift and brutal. Industrial production plunged, unemployment rose sharply, and the stock market dropped again. The Roosevelt recession, as critics called it, revealed how dependent the economy had become on government stimulus and how far it was from self-sustaining growth. Europe's picture was equally complex. In Germany, Hitler's regime continued to trumpet economic success. Rearmament was in full swing, with factories churning out weapons, planes, and tanks at a pace unmatched in peacetime history. Unemployment figures fell to near zero, but only because vast sums were poured into militarization, and because women, Jews, and political opponents had been pushed out of the workforce. The economy was increasingly geared toward war, a reality masked by the regime's propaganda of national renewal. Italy, too, tied its economic fortunes to militarism. The conquest of Ethiopia in 1935 had been costly, but Mussolini presented it as proof of fascist strength and Italy's place among the great powers. Yet sanctions, military expenses, and inefficiency drained the nation's resources, leaving the economy dependent on state intervention and foreign imports for critical materials. Britain's economy was slowly improving, aided by low interest rates, housing construction, and imperial trade preferences. But the benefits were uneven. The South prospered while the industrial North continued to languish. The government's cautious approach avoided large deficits, but it also limited the pace of recovery. Political attention was increasingly drawn to foreign affairs as Nazi Germany's ambitions became harder to ignore. France, after abandoning the gold standard in 1936, experienced a brief surge under the Popular Front government of Léon Blum. Labor reforms, including shorter workweeks and paid vacations, were celebrated by workers but resisted by employers, who claimed the changes undermined competitiveness. economic gains soon stalled, and political opposition from both right and left eroded the Popular Front's unity. By 1937, the coalition was faltering, and the nation's divisions were deepening. Internationally, economic nationalism still strangled global trade. Nations clung to tariff walls and currency blocks, protecting domestic markets at the expense of international cooperation. This isolationism reinforced the trend toward militarization in the authoritarian states, where leaders portrayed expansion as the only path to secure resources and markets. The most ominous developments of the period were geopolitical. In 1936, Germany reoccupied the Rhineland in defiance of the Versailles Treaty, meeting no military resistance from Britain or France. The same year, civil war erupted in Spain, pitting the Republican government against Francisco Franco's nationalists. The conflict quickly became an international proxy war. Germany and Italy sent troops, aircraft, and arms to aid Franco, while the Soviet Union backed the Republicans. Thousands of volunteers from around the world joined the fight, seeing it as a battle between fascism and democracy. In Asia, Japan escalated its expansionist policies. After consolidating control over Manchuria, it pushed deeper into northern China, setting the stage for the full-scale Second Sino-Japanese War in 1937. Japanese leaders argued that the nation's survival depended on controlling Asia's resources and markets, a rationale driven as much by ideology as by economics. By the close of 1937, the world stood at a crossroads. Economies had partially recovered, but the Depression's wounds had not healed, and the underlying conditions of instability remained. The authoritarian powers, Germany, Italy, Japan, had turned their recoveries into engines for conquest. Democracies, still scarred by the memory of war and economic collapse, hesitated to confront them. The fragile recovery of the mid-1930s was giving way to a new reality. The world was sliding, step by step, toward another global conflict. By 1938, the Great Depression's direct grip on daily economic life had loosened in many nations, but its shadow still stretched across the globe. The scars it left, high unemployment in some regions, political instability, and the erosion of trust in democratic institutions, were now feeding directly into a more dangerous transformation: the drive toward war as a tool of recovery and national revival. In Germany, Adolf Hitler's economic miracle was reaching its limits. Rearmament and public works had revived industry and eliminated visible unemployment, but these programs were expensive and heavily dependent on imported raw materials. Foreign currency reserves were dwindling, and the Reich's economic planners faced a stark choice: slow the pace of growth or seize new territories rich in resources. Hitler had no intention of slowing down. In March 1938, Germany annexed Austria in the Anschluss, presenting it as a joyous unification of German-speaking peoples. Economically, it gave the Reich new resources, industries, and gold reserves, an infusion that temporarily eased its financial pressures. Later that year came the crisis over the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia. German propaganda inflamed tensions, demanding the territory's transfer under the guise of self-determination for ethnic Germans. Britain's Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain and France's leaders, desperate to avoid war, pursued a policy of appeasement. At the Munich Conference in September 1938, they agreed to cede the Sudetenland to Germany in exchange for Hitler's promise of no further territorial demands. The deal was hailed in London as peace for our time, but in reality, it fed the Nazi regime's appetite for expansion. Italy, meanwhile, continued its imperial pursuits. Mussolini solidified control over Ethiopia and aligned more closely with Hitler, formalizing their alliance in the Pact of Steel. Like Germany, Italy's economic recovery was fragile, built on state spending and military mobilization. Conquests were framed not just as political triumphs, but as economic necessities in a world still fractured by protectionism and competition for resources. Japan's war in China expanded into a brutal full-scale conflict after the Marco Polo Bridge incident in July 1937. By 1938, Japanese forces had captured key cities, including Nanjing, where the atrocities of the Nanjing massacre shocked the world. Japan's leaders argued that domination of East Asia was essential for securing the raw materials and markets denied to them by Western-dominated trade systems. The war strained Japan's economy but also deepened its militarization and commitment to expansion. In the United States, the Roosevelt recession of 1937 had shaken confidence, but by 1938 to 1939, the economy began to recover again, aided by renewed government spending and the gradual buildup of defense industries. Still, the wounds of the Depression kept America wary of foreign entanglements. Isolationist sentiment was strong, and Congress passed laws aimed at keeping the nation out of overseas conflicts. Yet events abroad were beginning to erode the illusion that America could remain untouched by the gathering storm. Britain and France, though economically improved since the early 1930s, were still constrained by the Depression's aftereffects. Public debt remained high, and rearmament programs lagged behind those of Germany. Political leaders were torn between the need to strengthen defenses and the fear of provoking another devastating war. In both nations, memories of the slaughter of World War I remained vivid, shaping every policy decision. The global economy, while more active than during the Depression's depths, remained fractured. Tariff barriers persisted, and trade was increasingly conducted within exclusive blocs. The British Empire's imperial preference system, Germany's autarkic economic sphere, and Japan's planned Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. These economic divisions mirrored the emerging military alliances and reinforced the sense that cooperation between the great powers was no longer possible. By early 1939, the illusion of peace was unraveling. In March, Hitler violated the Munich Agreement by seizing the rest of Czechoslovakia, an unmistakable signal that his ambitions went far beyond uniting German-speaking peoples. Britain and France, jolted from their appeasement policy, guaranteed the independence of Poland, a promise that would soon be tested. In August, Germany signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with the Soviet Union, a non-aggression agreement that secretly divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. On September 1, 1939, German forces invaded Poland. 2 days later, Britain and France declared war on Germany. The Second World War had begun not in spite of the Great Depression but in many ways because of it. The economic devastation of the 1930s had destabilized governments, undermined democracies, and given rise to regimes that saw expansion and militarization as the only path to national salvation. The decade's crisis had not just reshaped economies. It had redrawn the map of power, and now the world would pay the price in blood. When the guns of September 1939 roared across Europe, the world entered a new and even more destructive era, but it did so with the economic scars of the Great Depression still fresh. The lessons, traumas, and policies of the 1930s profoundly shaped how nations approached the conflict, from their military strategies to the mobilization of their home fronts. For Germany, the Depression had been both a crucible and a catalyst. Hitler's economic policies of the late 1930s had fused rearmament with recovery, creating an economy primed for war but brittle beneath its propaganda sheen. The invasion of Poland was as much a strategic conquest as it was an economic gambit, securing farmland, raw materials, and strategic corridors to sustain the Reich's ambitions. From the outset, Nazi planners viewed war as a means of breaking free from the constraints of global trade systems that had left them vulnerable during the Depression. The vision was clear: a self-sufficient empire carved from conquest, immune to the economic cycles that had humbled the Weimar Republic. Britain and France entered the war with economies still marked by the caution born of Depression-era austerity. Both had increased defense spending in the late 1930s, but rearmament was incomplete, and memories of economic hardship tempered their willingness to wage total war from the start. British industry, still recovering from years of underinvestment, required a rapid shift from peacetime to wartime production, a transformation complicated by the lingering structural weaknesses in coal, steel, and shipbuilding. France faced similar challenges, compounded by political divisions, and the scars of high unemployment that had only recently eased. In the United States, the outbreak of war found the economy still in the final stages of Depression recovery. Roosevelt's New Deal had reshaped the social and political landscape, but unemployment remained significant. The early war years in Europe created a surge in demand for American goods, as Britain and France turned to U.S. factories for weapons, aircraft, and supplies. Initially constrained by neutrality acts, Roosevelt pushed through measures like cash and carry and later Lend-Lease, turning America into the arsenal of democracy. This influx of military production orders provided the final spark that ended the Depression in the United States, restoring full employment before America even entered the war. Japan, still bogged down in its war with China, viewed the European conflict as an opportunity born from Depression-era rivalries. The economic nationalism and resource hunger that had driven its expansion in the 1930s now accelerated. With Western powers distracted, Japan sought to secure access to oil, rubber, and minerals across Southeast Asia, resources it considered vital after years of economic isolation and Western embargoes. The Soviet Union, too, entered the war with its Depression-era trajectory shaping its strategy. Stalin's industrialization drive of the 1930s had built massive armaments capacity, though often at staggering human cost. The USSR's temporary alliance with Nazi Germany, cemented in the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, reflected a deeply pragmatic reading of the world order. The capitalist West was fractured, and the economic devastation of the Depression had weakened its ability to confront authoritarian aggression. On the home fronts of all major powers, the memory of the Depression influenced how societies responded to the demands of total war. Governments knew that mass unemployment and idle factories had been poison to political stability. Now they mobilized resources on a scale unimaginable in peacetime. In Germany, state-directed labor and resource allocation intensified, often exploiting occupied territories for economic gain. In Britain, wartime rationing, price controls, and full employment erased the Depression's joblessness but also brought tight state oversight over daily life. In the United States, the promise of steady work in defense plants drew millions from rural areas to booming industrial cities, permanently altering the nation's demographic map. The Depression had also altered global alliances. Economic weakness in the 1930s had fractured collective security efforts and emboldened aggressors. Now, wartime coalitions formed out of necessity rather than ideology. Britain and the United States set aside trade disputes of the Depression era to coordinate industrial production and supply chains. The Soviet Union, despite deep distrust of the West, would later join this alliance after Germany's invasion in 1941. By 1940 and 1941, it was clear that the Great Depression had not been erased by the war, it had been transformed. The same hunger for resources, markets, and self-sufficiency that had defined the 1930s was now pursued through military conquest and global conflict. The war economy delivered full employment and industrial boom, but it also bound national prosperity directly to the fortunes of the battlefield. The lessons of the Depression about vulnerability, scarcity, and the fragility of international trade were being applied not to rebuild peace, but to wage war on an unprecedented scale. By 1943, the tide of the Second World War was beginning to turn in the Allies' favor. Victories at Stalingrad and El Alamein, and the steady advance in the Pacific, signaled that the Axis powers could be defeated. Yet even as armies fought on distant fronts, the Allied leadership was deeply engaged in a parallel battle, designing the economic foundations of the peace to come. The trauma of the Great Depression loomed over every discussion. The war might end with military victory, but unless the post-war world avoided the economic fragmentation of the 1930s, peace itself could prove short-lived. The urgency for planning was rooted in hard experience. After the First World War, economic arrangements had been an afterthought, overshadowed by territorial settlements and punitive reparations. The interwar years had shown the cost of that neglect. Competitive devaluations, tariff wars, collapsing trade, and a global depression that had fueled political extremism. Now, Roosevelt, Churchill, and their advisors were determined to avoid repeating those mistakes. The push for a new economic framework gained momentum in Washington and London. John Maynard Keynes, representing Britain, envisioned a bold system of international finance anchored by a central clearing union with a new world currency, the Bancor. The goal was to keep trade flowing, prevent countries from running chronic deficits or surpluses, and avoid the balance of payments crises that had crippled the interwar economy. On the American side, Harry Dexter White proposed a different structure, one that emphasized stable exchange rates linked to gold and the US dollar, backed by an International Monetary Fund, IMF, to assist nations in difficulty. In July 1944, these competing visions came together at the United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. Delegates from 44 allied nations gathered in the secluded mountain resort, debating not the immediate tactics of war, but the long-term architecture of the world economy. It was a striking contrast. While tanks rolled through Normandy and bombers pounded German cities, inside the conference hall, suits and ledgers replaced uniforms and rifles. The agreement reached at Bretton Woods created the IMF to oversee exchange rates and provide short-term financing to countries in trouble, and the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, later known as the World Bank, to finance rebuilding and development. The system established fixed but adjustable exchange rates, with currencies pegged to the US dollar, itself convertible into gold. This arrangement reflected both America's wartime economic dominance and the Allies' desire for stability without the rigid inflexibility of the old gold standard. The influence of the Depression was evident in every clause. The architects of Bretton Woods sought to ensure that no nation would again be forced into deflationary spirals to defend an overvalued currency, as Britain had in the early 1930s, or into the isolation of tariff walls like those of the Smoot-Hawley era. They believed that prosperity had to be shared, and that the health of one nation's economy was inseparable from the health of the global system. Even outside Bretton Woods, wartime diplomacy laid the groundwork for institutions aimed at preventing the economic nationalism that had undermined the interwar peace. The Allies discussed reducing trade barriers through a future international trade organization and planning for coordinated reconstruction aid. Behind these initiatives was the memory of how post-1918 economic chaos had driven nations toward authoritarianism and war. Not all visions were harmonious. The Soviet Union, though officially represented at Bretton Woods, viewed the system with suspicion, seeing it as a framework dominated by capitalist powers. Stalin was far more interested in establishing control over Eastern Europe than in joining an integrated world economy. His reluctance foreshadowed the economic divide that would define the Cold War. Still, the decisions taken in 1944 marked a turning point. For the first time, the major powers were attempting to create an international economic order before the guns fell silent, using the bitter lessons of the Great Depression as a guide. Whether these institutions could survive the inevitable post-war rivalries remained uncertain, but the very act of planning was a sign that the Allies understood a fundamental truth: that economic collapse was as dangerous an enemy to peace as any army in the field. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the world stood amid a level of destruction that dwarfed even the worst days of the Great Depression. Entire cities lay in ruins, industrial heartlands were gutted, transport networks had been bombed into twisted heaps of steel and stone. Tens of millions were dead, and millions more were displaced, wandering across a shattered continent and beyond in search of home, food, and safety. Yet amid the rubble, the victors faced a profound question. Would the post-war world repeat the mistakes of the 1920s and 1930s, or had the lessons of the Depression been learned deeply enough to forge something new? Economically, the war had ended the Depression in most countries, but only by replacing consumer markets with war production. Now the danger was that the end of hostilities would trigger another collapse. Demobilized soldiers flooding back into the labor market, arms factories shutting down, and demand for war material vanishing almost overnight. Leaders knew that without careful planning, the victory celebrations could give way to mass unemployment and renewed instability, just as they had after 1918. In the United States, the challenge was immense. The nation emerged from the war with its industrial base not only intact but expanded, having produced nearly half of the world's manufactured goods in 1945. Yet this dominance came with the responsibility to lead in rebuilding shattered economies abroad. Roosevelt's successor, Harry S. Truman, embraced the idea that America's security was bound to global prosperity, a conviction rooted in the belief, sharpened by the Depression, that economic desperation bred political extremism and conflict. In Europe, the scale of devastation demanded unprecedented cooperation. Britain, though victorious, was financially exhausted, burdened with debt and reliant on American aid to import food and raw materials. France faced the monumental task of reconstructing industries and infrastructure destroyed during the German occupation. Germany itself was in ruins, its cities bombed to rubble, its economy dismantled under Allied occupation. Even the Soviet Union, despite its vast military triumph, had suffered catastrophic losses. Cities leveled, millions of dead, and farmland laid waste. The Depression's memory hung over every conference and negotiation. The Allies were determined to avoid the harsh reparations and economic isolation that had crippled Germany after World War I. Instead, economic revival was seen as essential for stability. This thinking underpinned the early seeds of what would become the Marshall Plan, an American-led effort to pour billions into European reconstruction, not as charity, but as an investment in a peaceful, cooperative world order. Internationally, the new institutions born from wartime planning began to take shape. The International Monetary Fund and the World Bank opened their doors, promising to provide the stability and capital flows that had been absent during the Depression years. At the same time, the United Nations was established in 1945 with an economic as well as a political mandate. Its charter committed members to promoting higher living standards, full employment, and conditions for economic and social progress. Yet the shadow of economic division was already lengthening. The Soviet Union, deeply suspicious of Western-led institutions, moved to establish its own sphere of economic control in Eastern Europe. While the Western Allies spoke of open markets and global integration, Stalin focused on securing self-sufficiency within the communist bloc, convinced that the capitalist world would eventually turn hostile. This divergence, rooted in part in the vastly different experiences of the Depression, was an early fault line in what would become the Cold War. In Asia, Japan faced a reconstruction every bit as daunting as Europe's. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki had obliterated not only cities but the psychological foundation of its imperial ambitions. Under U.S. occupation, the Japanese economy would be rebuilt with an emphasis on democratic governance, land reform, and integration into a global economic system that planners hoped would prevent a return to the militarism of the 1930s. By the close of 1945, the world was at once exhausted and brimming with possibility. The Depression had shown how economic collapse could corrode the foundations of peace, and the war had shown how quickly that corrosion could lead to catastrophe. The New World Order, still fragile, was built on a determination to bind nations together through economic interdependence, mutual aid, and institutions designed to prevent the spiral into isolationism and protectionism that had marked the interwar years. Whether those ambitions could survive the political rivalries of the coming decades was uncertain, but the resolve to try was one of the lasting legacies of both the Great Depression and the war it helped to shape. The immediate post-war years were a race against both time and history. From 1946 to 1949, the promise of a new world order, forged in the shadow of the Great Depression, was tested by the grinding realities of Reconstruction and the deepening mistrust between the former wartime allies. The choices made in these years would determine whether the hard lessons of the interwar collapse would endure or be forgotten. Europe in 1946 was a continent still in shock. In France, coal production lagged, factories lay in ruins, and railways barely functioned. Britain faced severe rationing. Bread, which had remained available during the war, was now limited for the first time. Germany was divided into occupation zones, its economy barely functioning, and its cities were vast fields of rubble. Across the continent, shortages were not limited to food and fuel. There was also a shortage of faith that recovery was truly possible. In Washington, policymakers saw the danger in stark terms. Without swift economic revival, Western Europe could slip into the same spiral of poverty and extremism that had followed the First World War. In 1947, U.S. Secretary of State George C. Marshall unveiled a bold proposal. The United States would provide massive financial aid to rebuild European economies, restore trade, and stabilize political systems. The European Recovery Program, soon known simply as the Marshall Plan, offered over $13 billion, more than $140 billion in today's value, to participating nations over 4 years. The plan was as much about politics as economics. By tying aid to cooperation, it encouraged European nations to work together, fostering the first steps toward integration. It also made clear that the United States saw prosperity as a bulwark against the spread of communism, a direct response to the way Depression-era hardship had fueled extremist movements in the 1930s. The Soviet Union, however, viewed the Marshall Plan as an instrument of American influence. Joseph Stalin forbade Eastern Bloc countries from participating and tightened Moscow's grip on their economies. Instead, the USSR organized the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, Comecon, in 1949, promoting trade and development within the communist bloc. Eastern Europe's economies were reshaped to serve Soviet needs, with heavy industry prioritized over consumer goods, and integration into the global capitalist market firmly blocked. In Western Europe, Marshall Plan aid began to bear fruit almost immediately. American funds rebuilt factories, modernized agriculture, and repaired transportation networks. Industrial output surged, food shortages eased, and currencies stabilized. The psychological effect was just as important. Confidence returned, and the specter of the Depression receded. The cooperation fostered by the plan laid the groundwork for future European institutions, including the 1951 European Coal and Steel Community, the precursor to the European Union. In Asia, the U.S. occupation of Japan, led by General Douglas MacArthur, embarked on an ambitious reconstruction program. Land reform broke up large estates, empowering tenant farmers. New labor laws encouraged unions, and American aid helped rebuild infrastructure. By the late 1940s, Japan's economy was on a path of steady growth, integrated into a U.S.-led trade system that contrasted sharply with the autarkic militarism of the 1930s. Meanwhile, in China, the civil war between nationalists and communists entered its decisive phase. The economic devastation of both the Depression and years of Japanese occupation had left the country in ruins. Hyperinflation and corruption weakened the nationalist government, paving the way for Mao Zedong's communist forces to seize power in 1949. China's shift to a planned economy placed it outside the Western-led reconstruction system, deepening the global divide. By 1949, the fault lines of the Cold War were firmly drawn. The institutions and ideals that had emerged from the Great Depression, international cooperation, open markets, and coordinated economic policy, were now only half realized. In the West, they formed the backbone of a growing transatlantic alliance. In the East, they were rejected in favor of centrally planned, insulated economies. Yet, for all the division, the post-war recovery in Western Europe and Japan stood in stark contrast to the disintegration of the 1930s. The Depression had taught that economic collapse could destroy democracy and invite dictatorship. Now, leaders were determined to use prosperity as a shield against those dangers. The challenge ahead would be to sustain that prosperity in a world once again split into competing visions, each claiming to offer the true path to stability and peace. By the early 1950s, the bombs of the Second World War had fallen silent, the rubble of its battlefields was slowly cleared, and the reconstruction of shattered nations was well underway. Yet beneath the visible rebuilding lay a deeper continuity, the imprint of the Great Depression, etched into the political and economic systems of the post-war world. Even as economies surged and optimism returned, the memory of the collapse of the 1930s remained a guiding force for leaders, policymakers, and citizens alike. The most immediate legacy was institutional. The International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, conceived in the later war years to prevent the currency crises and capital flight of the Depression era, became central pillars of the new economic order. The General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade GATT, established in 1947, worked to lower trade barriers, reversing the protectionism that had strangled global commerce in the 1930s. For many in the West, these institutions represented not just technical reforms but a moral commitment. Prosperity and peace were inseparable, and economic cooperation was a form of collective security. National economic policies were also transformed. In the United States, the political consensus embraced the idea, unthinkable before the Depression, that government had both the authority and responsibility to intervene during downturns. Keynesian economics, with its emphasis on managing demand through public spending and fiscal policy, became orthodoxy in much of the democratic world. In Western Europe, social safety nets expanded, unemployment insurance was strengthened, and welfare programs were developed to protect citizens from the kind of destitution that had haunted the early 1930s. In Japan and West Germany, U.S.-guided reconstruction programs fostered export-oriented economies, tightly integrated into global trade systems. Both nations, devastated by war, avoided the economic isolationism that had fed militarism in the interwar years. Instead, they tied their growth to international markets, a strategic choice shaped by the recognition that autarky and protectionism had been paths to ruin. The Eastern Bloc, by contrast, drew a different lesson from the Depression. Soviet leaders pointed to the capitalist collapse of the 1930s as proof that central planning offered a more stable alternative. In the USSR and its satellite states, economic policy was directed toward state control of production, fixed prices, and insulation from global market swings. This division of economic models, rooted in competing interpretations of the Depression's causes, became a defining feature of the Cold War. The Depression also reshaped political thought. In the West, the fear of repeating the mistakes that had allowed fascism to flourish gave urgency to preserving democratic legitimacy through economic security. The post-war welfare state was as much a political safeguard as an economic one. In the East, the narrative of capitalism's failure justified authoritarian rule and tight control over economic life. Even the psychology of the era bore the Depression's mark. For a generation that had lived through both the collapse of the 1930s and the sacrifices of war, thrift, caution, and a suspicion of speculative excess became ingrained habits. Policymakers treated full employment as a political necessity, not just an economic goal. Central banks and finance ministries monitored markets for signs of instability with a vigilance born of painful memory. Over time, the rapid growth of the 1950s and 1960s seemed to banish the specter of another Great Depression. Yet the institutions, policies, and alliances forged in response to that crisis remained the framework of the modern global economy. The idea that economic collapse could trigger political catastrophe was never forgotten. It was embedded in everything from trade agreements to social welfare laws, from the structure of NATO to the rebuilding of Japan. The Great Depression had begun as a financial panic on Wall Street, but its reach had been global and transformative. It had toppled governments, redrawn ideologies, and altered the balance of power in the world. In the decades that followed, it served both as a warning and as a blueprint, a reminder of the dangers of economic isolation and a guide to building systems that could withstand the storms of the future. By mid-century, the world had moved on from the breadlines and bank failures of the 1930s, but it had not moved past their lessons. In the post-war prosperity, in the very architecture of the international order, the shadow of the Great Depression still stretched long, shaping a world determined never to let such a collapse happen again, even as history, patient and relentless, waited to test that resolve.